The first thing I noticed about Bellweather was that nobody looked tired. I had driven into the small town in northern Michigan just after sunset, expecting to spend one night at a roadside motel before continuing my trip west. Instead, I found a place that felt strangely awake. Every house had its lights on. Every diner table was occupied. People walked along the sidewalks carrying coffee, talking quietly, staring at their phones. It was nearly midnight, yet the town looked as if morning had just begun. At the motel counter, an elderly receptionist handed me a key and said, "Don't worry if you can't sleep." I laughed and asked if the rooms were noisy. She stared at me for several seconds before answering, "Nobody in Bellweather sleeps anymore." I thought she was joking until I entered my room. The bed looked perfectly comfortable, but something about the walls immediately unsettled me. Dozens of tiny scratches covered the paint around the headboard, as if someone had repeatedly dragged their fingernails across it. On the nightstand sat an old digital clock displaying 12:17 a.m. I took a shower, turned off the lights, and tried to sleep. Within minutes, I heard footsteps moving through the hallway outside. Slow footsteps. They passed my door, stopped, then continued. A few minutes later, they returned. Then again. I opened the door and looked outside. The hallway was empty, but every other motel room had its door slightly open, and behind each doorway, people were sitting awake in darkness, staring silently at the ceiling. At 2:12 a.m., I gave up trying to sleep and walked into town. The diner was still open, filled with people drinking coffee beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Everyone looked exhausted, but nobody seemed capable of closing their eyes. I sat at the counter and asked the waitress what was happening. She stopped pouring coffee and stared at me. "You're new here," she whispered. I nodded. She leaned closer. "Don't fall asleep." Before I could ask why, every customer in the diner suddenly stopped talking. Their heads turned toward the front window at exactly the same time. Outside, beneath a flickering street lamp, stood a pale man wearing an old gray coat. He was completely motionless. His eyes were fixed on the diner. Then he slowly raised one hand and pointed directly at me. The waitress grabbed my wrist so hard that her fingernails dug into my skin. "Don't look at him," she whispered. I turned away, but curiosity forced me to glance back a few seconds later. The man was gone. The waitress finally explained that 3 years earlier, people in Bellweather had suddenly stopped sleeping. Doctors came, researchers came, and hospitals filled with patients who hadn't slept for weeks. But nobody died. Instead, people simply became more awake, more alert, and eventually more frightened. Then strange things started happening at night. People heard footsteps outside their homes. They heard voices beneath the streets. And every few weeks, someone reported seeing the same pale man. The waitress looked toward the window again and whispered, "He only appears when someone new comes to town." Then she looked directly into my eyes. "And tonight, you're the new one." I left the diner at 3:15 a.m., but the waitress's warning followed me all the way back to the motel. The streets were completely empty now. No cars moved, no dogs barked. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. As I approached the motel, I noticed every room was still illuminated. People were standing behind their curtains, watching the street. Then I saw the pale man again. He stood at the far end of the parking lot beneath a broken streetlight. This time, he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the motel building. I took a step backward, and he suddenly turned his head toward me. His mouth opened, but instead of speaking, he whispered something that I couldn't hear. Then every light in the motel went out at once. I ran inside and locked my room. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the key twice. I sat on the bed and tried to convince myself that exhaustion was making me hallucinate. Then the digital clock changed from 3:17 a.m. to 3:18 a.m. Immediately, someone knocked on my door. 3 slow knocks. I didn't move. Another 3 knocks followed. Then a woman's voice whispered from the hallway, "Please open the door." It sounded exactly like my mother's voice. My mother had been dead for 12 years. I backed away from the door as the voice became more desperate. "Please. I'm cold." I covered my ears, but the voice continued inside my head. Then something scratched slowly across the other side of the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police. The call connected immediately, but nobody answered. Instead, I heard dozens of people breathing heavily on the other end. Then a dispatcher whispered, "Are you inside Bellweather?" I said yes. There was a long silence. "Then whatever you do, don't sleep." I asked her why. Her voice became terrified. "Because the thing beneath Bellweather doesn't attack people who are awake. It enters their dreams." Before I could ask anything else, the call disconnected. My phone immediately displayed a new message from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. "It knows you're here." Then another message appeared. "Look under your bed." I refused to look. I stood completely still, staring at the floor. Something beneath the bed slowly moved. I heard fingernails dragging across the carpet. Then a quiet voice came from underneath. "You shouldn't have come back." My blood turned cold. I slowly stepped away and reached for the lamp. The moment I switched it on, the room was empty. But the mattress had changed. Across the white sheets were dozens of fresh, muddy footprints, beginning at the edge of the bed and ending directly in front of the bathroom mirror. I looked at my reflection. It was staring back at me. Then I noticed something wrong. I wasn't blinking. My reflection smiled. I didn't. I stumbled backward from the mirror, nearly falling over the chair behind me. My reflection continued smiling, even though my face had gone completely pale. Then it slowly raised one finger and pressed it against its lips. Behind the glass, something moved in the darkness of the bathroom. I turned around, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, my reflection was normal again. I grabbed my phone and ran out of the room. The motel hallway was filled with people now. Every guest stood outside their doors, staring at the ceiling. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then the receptionist appeared at the end of the hallway, carrying an old metal box. She looked directly at me and whispered, "You saw it, didn't you?" I followed her downstairs because I needed answers. She took me into a small office behind the front desk and locked the door. From the metal box, she removed several yellowed newspaper clippings and an old photograph. The photograph showed Bellweather in 1989. Hundreds of people stood outside the church in the center of town. I recognized the pale man immediately. He was standing among the crowd. The receptionist pointed to him. "That's Dr. Elias Vane. He led the sleep experiment beneath the church." She explained that the researchers had discovered a strange underground chamber containing something they couldn't identify. They believed it could influence human dreams. They experimented on themselves, trying to communicate with whatever was sleeping beneath the town. Instead, they accidentally created a connection between it and every person in Bellweather. "That's why nobody can sleep," she said. "We're keeping it trapped inside our dreams. If everyone sleeps at the same time, it wakes up." I asked why the pale man was following me. The receptionist's expression became serious. "Because you were part of the original experiment." I laughed nervously and told her that was impossible. I had only arrived that night. She shook her head. "No, you were born here." She showed me another photograph. It was taken 30 years earlier. A group of researchers stood outside the underground laboratory. In the center was a young woman holding a baby. The baby's face was mine. I stared at the photograph, unable to understand what I was seeing. The receptionist whispered, "Your parents were researchers. They escaped with you when the experiment went wrong." Before I could ask another question, the entire building shook. A deep, rumbling sound came from beneath the floor. The receptionist dropped the photograph. Every light in the office flickered. Then the motel guests outside began screaming. We rushed into the hallway and saw something impossible. Every person in the building had fallen asleep standing up. Their eyes were closed, but their mouths were moving, as if they were speaking to someone inside a dream. Then all of them opened their eyes at exactly the same moment. They looked directly at me. In perfect unison, they whispered, "He remembers." The receptionist grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back exit. "It's awake," she said, "and now it knows where you are." We ran through the back streets toward the old church while the entire town seemed to collapse into silence behind us. Every window was dark now, but I could see people standing motionless inside their homes. As we passed them, their heads slowly turned toward me. Nobody followed us. They simply watched. When we reached the church, the heavy wooden doors were already open. A staircase beneath the altar led deep underground. The receptionist handed me a rusted key and whispered, "Your parents sealed the chamber 30 years ago. They left you outside Bellweather because they knew one day it would call you back." I asked what was inside. She looked toward the darkness below. Something that learned how to dream using human minds. At the bottom of the stairs, we found a massive underground room filled with old laboratory equipment. Broken monitors covered the walls, and hundreds of photographs were scattered across the floor. In the center stood a circular metal machine surrounding a deep black pit. The pit seemed to have no bottom. As I approached it, I heard my mother's voice. "I'm sorry." Then my father's voice followed. "We couldn't stop it." I suddenly remembered everything. I remembered being a child inside this laboratory. I remembered my parents placing headphones over my ears while the machine started. I remembered hearing,